Shalom, I'm Tony Robinson of Restoration of Torah Ministries, and we're going to be talking about resurrection in the Tanakh. We're going to reveal the Tanakh's extensive amount of teaching on resurrection. We're going to be flying today, so hold on to your seatbelts because here we go. First, we're going to talk about stories of literal death and resurrection. Let's look at the widow of Zarephath. In 1 Kings 17, it says, Then he, that's Elijah, cried out to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son? And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord. And it goes on to say, and the soul of the child came back to him. Now remember, this is we're studying thematically here at Restoration of Torah, so let's notice some of the major themes here. This is a literal resurrection. We note the language of resurrection. His soul came back to him and he revived. It was noticed that Elijah stretched himself upon the child 3 times. So here we have a clear thematic connection between the number 3 and resurrection. This is one of the stories where 3 is associated with resurrection. Now, if this were the only story where this was true, this would just be a mere coincidence. But as we study thematically, what we're going to see is that this occurs quite often. So let's continue. Let's look at the next story of literal death and resurrection. This is the Shunammite woman. In 2 Kings 4, it says, He stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. He returned and walked back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on him. And the child sneezed 7 times and then opened his eyes. So what themes do we see here? Notice that this again is a literal resurrection. The child sneezed 7 times. So in this story we see a correlation between 7. These are and so now we have 2 stories of the resurrection of a youth. In both the story of the widow of Zarephath and the Shunammite woman, that it was a youth, a Na'ar and a Yeled. So that's another theme that connects these 2 stories. But they both feature resurrection from the dead. One has the number 3 and one has the number 7. Why is that? These are allusions to Numbers 19. Remember, Numbers 19 is the chapter that talks about how to, if a person came in contact with the dead, they had to be cleansed with the ashes of the red heifer, and that cleansing occurred on day 3 and day 7. So this is a clear allusion to the ashes of the red heifer and being cleansed on day 3 and day 7 from contact with the dead. So we're going to continue here with stories of literal resurrection here. And this time we're going to look at the story in 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 20 through 21. It says, Then Elisha died, or Elisha, and they buried him, and raiding bands from Moab invaded the land in the spring of the year. And so it was, as they were burying a man, that suddenly they spied a band of raiders, and they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet. So again, this is our third story of literal resurrection. And notice that it occurred in the spring, which is near Passover, hint, hint. But anyway, it's interesting to note that there are 3 stories in the Tanakh that speak of literal resurrections performed by a prophet. We just read those 3 stories, and it should and coincidentally, could I say? No, not coincidentally. There are also 3 stories in the New Testament of literal resurrections performed by the prophet Yeshua. In other words, what I want to suggest to you is that the Tanakh is anticipating the work of the Messiah. And so just as there were 3 resurrections by a prophet in the Tanakh, there are 3 resurrections by Yeshua in the gospel. Now, the correlation doesn't just stop there. Okay, because again, as we study thematically, because this is how Adonai has put his word together, and so if we follow the themes, then we will enter into his wisdom. There was the resurrection of a widow's child. Okay, in the Tanakh, it was the widow of Zarephath. In the gospel, it was the widow of Nain. Okay, so in other words, what we're going to do here, as we've already seen that there are 3 stories of literal resurrection performed by a prophet in the Tanakh. There are 3 stories of resurrection by Yeshua in the Gospels, and now we're going to see that each of those 3 in the Tanakh and 3 in the Gospel are correlated. So there was a widow widow Zarephath, and the widow of Nain. Excuse me. There was also the resurrection of a prominent person's child, the Shunammite woman. It says that she was an Isha Gedolah, a great woman. And in the New Testament, it was Jairus who was the leader of the synagogue there. So there was a resurrection of a prominent person's child. And then the last example was the resurrection of a dead man. In the Tanakh, remember the man that was thrown into Elisha's grave and then he was resurrected, whereas in the Gospels, Lazarus was actually in a tomb, had been in a tomb for 4 days plus, and he was resurrected, okay? And so what have we learned? That there are 3 stories in the Tanakh that teach about resurrection by a prophet, and these 3 stories correlate thematically with the 3 stories of resurrection by Yeshua in the Gospels. We also learned that the number 3 figures prominently in the stories of resurrection in the Tanakh, and I'm being obnoxious on purpose. Because Adonai is communicating to us thematically by associating the number 3 with resurrection. And so what we're going to see as we continue to go through these series of teachings is that the idea of resurrection on day 3 is clearly a concept taught thematically in the Tanakh. It's not something new to the New Testament, but we're going to continue to see that resurrection is associated with the number 3 throughout the Tanakh, and there's more to come. Shalom, shalom.